Billionaire heard the black waitress praying in the kitchen. One name in her prayer broke him. Richard stood in the marble hallway of his flagship restaurant, adjusting his Armani cufflinks as kitchen sounds drifted through the swinging doors. At 42, he owned 17 establishments across 3 states, each one a testament to his relentless pursuit of perfection. Tonight's inspection was routine, until he heard her voice. Soft, trembling, and barely audible above the clatter of dishes, a woman was praying in the kitchen. He paused, his hand frozen on the door handle. The words weren't meant for him, weren't meant for anyone but heaven itself, yet something in her tone made his chest tighten unexpectedly. He'd built his empire on cold efficiency, on treating employees like numbers on a spreadsheet. But this prayer, whispered between the prep stations and walk-in coolers, was about to shatter everything he thought he knew about the people who worked for him. Sometimes the most powerful moments arrive when we least expect them, don't they? Where are you watching from tonight? Richard had always prided himself on running a tight operation. The Sterling was his crown jewel, a restaurant where celebrities and politicians paid $300 for dinner and never questioned the bill. He knew every corner of this place, every system that kept the money flowing. What he didn't know were the names of half the people who made it possible. The kitchen staff was invisible to him, faces that changed seasonally, hands that prepared his profits, voices he never bothered to learn. Jasmine had been working the prep station for 8 months, arriving each morning at 5:30 to slice vegetables and portion sauces before the day shift began. At 35, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that invisibility was part of the job description. She never complained about the 12-hour shifts or the way some customers looked through her when she refilled their water glasses. This job, demanding as it was, represented something precious to her. Stability in a life that had known too little of it. The other kitchen workers respected her steady presence. Miguel, the head chef, had learned to rely on her consistent prep work. Janet, who worked guard manger, appreciated how Jasmine never left a mess for the next shift. Even Tony, the gruff dishwasher who rarely spoke to anyone, would nod when Jasmine asked if he needed anything before clocking out. She belonged here in a way that Richard, for all his ownership, never quite had. But tonight felt different. The dinner rush had been particularly brutal, with 2 large parties that arrived simultaneously and a critic from the Times dining at table 12. The kitchen hummed with controlled chaos as orders flew in faster than they could plate them. Jasmine worked steadily through it all, her hands never stopping, her focus never wavering. She'd learned long ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. As the last orders left the pass, the kitchen finally began to quiet. One by one, the staff started their closing routines. Jasmine stayed behind to finish cleaning her station, scrubbing the steel surfaces until they gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The familiar rhythm of closing tasks usually brought her peace, but tonight her mind kept drifting to the phone call she'd received that morning. The news had been devastating, yet she'd forced herself to come to work anyway. Bills didn't care about personal crises. It was then, alone with her thoughts and the weight of the day's revelations, that she felt the need to pray. She'd been raised in a church where prayer was as natural as breathing, where speaking to God required no special location or formal words. Standing there in the empty kitchen, surrounded by the tools of her trade, she closed her eyes and began to whisper the words that had been building inside her all day. Richard approached the kitchen doors with his usual purposeful stride, clipboard in hand, ready to inspect the closing procedures. He pushed through just far enough to see inside, then stopped. The scene before him was ordinary enough, just one woman finishing her shift. But her voice, soft and earnest in the fluorescent-lit space, made him pause in a way he hadn't in years. "Lord, I don't understand your plan, but I trust it," Jasmine whispered, her hands still moving as she spoke. "Please watch over Charlie tonight. He's so scared, and I can't be there with him. Let him know he's not alone, even when the nurses have to take him for more tests. Give him strength, God, because he's just a little boy and this is all too big for him to carry." Richard's clipboard slipped from his fingers, clattering against the doorframe. Charlie. The name hit him like a physical blow, transporting him back 20 years to a time when he was still learning the restaurant business, still making mistakes that cost real people their livelihoods. He remembered a sous chef named Charlie who'd worked for his father's original restaurant, a young man with gentle eyes and steady hands who'd dreamed of opening his own place someday. Jasmine continued, unaware of her audience. Please help me find a way to pay for his treatments. I know you don't give us more than we can handle, but this feels like too much. I'm trying so hard to be strong for him, to be the mother he deserves. If I could take his place, if I could bear this sickness for him, I would. Just don't let him suffer anymore. Please. The memory crystallized with devastating clarity. Richard recalled the night his father discovered money missing from the till. Money that Charlie had taken to pay for his son's medical bills. His father had been ruthless, pressing charges despite Charlie's desperate pleas. Richard, barely 22 and eager to prove himself worthy of inheriting the business, had supported the decision. They'd made an example of Charlie, ensuring he'd never work in another reputable kitchen again. I keep thinking about his father, Jasmine continued, her voice breaking slightly. Charlie asks about him sometimes, wonders why his daddy can't help us anymore. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that good people sometimes have to make impossible choices? How do you tell him that his father was destroyed by those choices, that he couldn't live with what happened next? Richard's legs felt weak. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him as the full weight of understanding crashed down. This woman, this employee he'd never bothered to learn about, was Charlie Sr.'s widow. The boy she was praying for was the child whose father had died by suicide 3 years after losing everything. A tragedy Richard had learned about through a brief newspaper obituary that mentioned Charlie's struggle with depression and financial ruin. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Stories like these remind us how connected we all are, how our actions ripple through lives in ways we never imagine. Jasmine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and began packing away the last of her supplies. She had no idea that her prayers had been heard by anyone other than God. No idea that the man responsible for her family's suffering stood just feet away, finally understanding the true cost of his youthful arrogance. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sound of the dining room being reset for tomorrow's service. Richard backed away from the doors, his heart pounding. The inspection could wait. Everything could wait while he processed this earth-shattering revelation. Richard spent the next 3 days and a daze, unable to concentrate on spreadsheets or staff meetings. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Charlie Sr.'s face. The devastation when the police arrived, the way his shoulders had slumped as they led him away in handcuffs. He'd convinced himself that pressing charges was a necessary evil, a way to maintain order and prevent future theft. Now he understood it for what it truly was, the destruction of a desperate father trying to save his child. He found himself researching Jasmine online, learning details that made his guilt deepen with each discovery. She'd worked 3 jobs before landing the position at the Sterling, trying to manage her son's medical expenses while dealing with her husband's depression and eventual suicide. Young Charlie suffered from a rare autoimmune condition that required expensive treatments not fully covered by insurance. The medical bills had piled up like mountains, and Jasmine faced them alone. The irony wasn't lost on him. She worked in his kitchen, helping generate the profits that afforded him his penthouse apartment and collection of luxury cars, while struggling to afford the very healthcare that could save her son's life. He'd built his empire on the principle that business was business, that personal problems couldn't interfere with the bottom line. But seeing the human cost of that philosophy made him physically ill. On Friday evening, Richard found himself at Mercy General Hospital, standing in the pediatric wing with a racing heart. He'd called ahead, claiming to be a family friend, and learned that Charlie was scheduled for surgery the following week, surgery that Jasmine couldn't afford without going into devastating debt. The boy needed the procedure to prevent his condition from progressing to organ failure, but the cost was staggering. Walking through those hospital corridors, Richard saw other families facing similar struggles. Parents sleeping in chairs beside their children's beds, mothers crying quietly in the bathroom, fathers making desperate phone calls about insurance coverage. Each scene reminded him that his wealth could solve problems that seemed insurmountable to others. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. He thought about his own father, a man who'd built their first restaurant through ruthless determination and an unwillingness to show weakness. Richard had learned to suppress empathy. to view it as a liability in the competitive world of business. But empathy, he now realized, wasn't weakness, it was what made someone fully human. His father's lessons had made him successful and hollow, wealthy and empty. That night, Richard called his lawyer and accountant, setting wheels in motion that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He couldn't undo the damage he'd caused to Charlie's family, couldn't bring back a father who'd been driven to despair. But he could ensure that the son survived and thrived, that Jasmine's prayers were answered in ways she never expected. Have you ever faced something like this? A moment when you realized the true impact of your actions? Let us know in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our struggles helps us heal. As he drove home through the city streets, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose that extended beyond profit margins. The scared young man who'd chosen cruelty over compassion was finally ready to grow into someone worthy of the power he'd accumulated. Monday morning arrived with an unusual purpose for Richard. He'd spent the weekend crafting a plan that would require delicate execution and complete honesty, two things that had never been his strong suits. The easy path would be to anonymously pay Charlie's medical bills and walk away with a clear conscience. But Richard understood that true redemption demanded more than a financial gesture. It required facing the full weight of his past actions. He waited until the evening shift began, then made his way to the kitchen. Jasmine was at her usual station, preparing vegetables for the dinner service. Her movements were precise but weary, and he could see the exhaustion that came from carrying impossible burdens. She looked up briefly when he entered, offering the polite nod that employees gave management before returning to her work. "Jasmine, could I speak with you privately?" Richard's voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. She glanced around the kitchen, clearly uncomfortable with being singled out by the owner. "You're not in trouble," he added quickly. "I just need to discuss something important with you." They walked to his office, a space that suddenly felt too formal and intimidating for the conversation he needed to have. Jasmine sat on the edge of the chair, her posture defensive, probably wondering if she was about to lose the job she desperately needed. Richard closed the door and took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change both their lives forever. "I knew your husband," he began, watching as confusion flickered across her face. "Charlie worked for my father's restaurant 20 years ago. He was a good man, a talented chef who loved his family more than anything." Richard's voice caught slightly. "I'm the reason he lost his job. I'm the one who destroyed his career and pushed your family into the darkness that eventually took him from you." The color drained from Jasmine's face. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair as the full implications of his confession sank in. "You're lying," she whispered, but something in his expression told her otherwise. "Charlie never told me exactly what happened, just that he'd made a terrible mistake and someone decided to make him pay for it forever." Richard forced himself to continue, to give her the complete truth she deserved. He explained about the missing money, about Charlie's desperate attempt to pay for his son's early treatments, about the decision to press charges and blacklist him from the industry. With each detail, he watched Jasmine's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and a grief so profound it seemed to fill the entire room. "He never got over it," she said finally, her voice hollow. "He blamed himself for everything that happened to our family after that. The bills, the foreclosure, the depression that ate him alive until he couldn't see any other way out. And you." She stood abruptly, backing toward the door. "You've been paying my salary while my son fights for his life with the same illness that drove his father to steal from you." The confrontation reached its peak as years of buried pain erupted between them. But in that moment of raw honesty, something shifted. Richard saw not just the consequences of his actions, but the possibility of redemption through genuine responsibility. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that explore the complicated ways our lives intersect. Jasmine stood frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face as decades of suppressed anguish finally found their voice. "Do you know what it's like," she asked, her voice trembling but strong, "to watch someone you love disappear piece by piece? Charlie stopped laughing first, then he stopped sleeping, then he stopped believing he deserved forgiveness. Every night, I watched him shrink a little more, until the man I married was just a shadow apologizing for breathing. Richard had prepared for anger, even violence. But her profound sadness was harder to bear than any accusation. "I know I can't undo what happened," he said quietly. "I know I can't bring him back or erase the years you've suffered. But I can ensure that your son, your Charlie, gets every treatment he needs. I can make sure his father's sacrifice wasn't meaningless." "It's not about money," Jasmine replied, wiping her eyes. "It was never about money. Charlie just wanted to save his little boy, and when he couldn't, when the system crushed him for trying, he believed he was worthless. You didn't just take his job, you took his identity as a father and provider." The truth of her words hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd spent years justifying his actions as necessary business decisions, never considering the human being behind the crime. Now, faced with the ripple effects of his choices, he felt the full weight of responsibility for another man's despair and death. They talked through the night, sharing memories of the man they'd both lost. Richard learned about Charlie's gentleness, his dreams of teaching young chefs, his devotion to his family, which ultimately led to his downfall. Jasmine heard about the scared young man who'd chosen harsh justice over compassion, who'd spent 20 years building walls around his heart to avoid confronting his mistakes. As dawn broke through the office windows, they'd reached an understanding that transcended simple forgiveness. Richard would fund Charlie Jr.'s treatment and education, but more importantly, he would honor Charlie Sr.'s memory by changing how he treated his employees. Jasmine would accept his help not as charity, but as a step toward healing the wounds they'd both carried too long. 6 months later, young Charlie was in remission, his laughter filling the pediatric ward where he'd once lain fighting for his life. Jasmine had been promoted to assistant manager, helping Richard implement new policies that supported workers facing personal crises. The Sterling now offered comprehensive healthcare and emergency assistance funds, ensuring no employee would face Charlie Sr.'s impossible choice between ethics and desperation. Richard kept a photo on his desk, not of his restaurants or achievements, but of Charlie Jr. playing baseball, a healthy boy given a second chance at life. The image reminded him daily that wealth without compassion was merely an elegant form of poverty. He'd learned that true success wasn't measured in profits, but in the number of lives you lifted instead of crushed. In quiet moments, Jasmine still prayed for Charlie Sr., but now her prayers carried gratitude alongside grief. She'd found peace knowing his death had ultimately led to healing, that his son would grow up in a world where his father's sacrifice was remembered and honored. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Sometimes our greatest mistakes become the pathway to our most meaningful redemption. Thank you for joining us on this journey of forgiveness and hope.